Hello and good morning. Welcome to this month's When Everything Breaks webinar, hosted by the American Planning Association, Los Angeles section. My name is Christoph Sadle. I'm a committee volunteer with APA Los Angeles and a member of Los Angeles section COVID response subcommittee. Today's webinar is the third installment of a new monthly talk series that seeks to elevate topics that our members have told us are top of mind for the planning profession in the environment where it feels like everything is broken. Today, our panelists will be discussing how the COVID-19 crisis impacts how equity factors into transportation service decisions. This issue has become even more urgent in light of civil unrest and protests across the country, really shining a light on the role public policy has in undoing systemic racism. I'd like to thank everyone who's joining us this morning, our wonderful guests. I'd like to thank all of our sponsors for supporting APA Los Angeles. Nina Idemudia will be our moderator for our discussion today. Nina is the Director of Planning at Muse Community and Design based out of Chicago, Illinois. Prior to moving to Chicago, Nina was a planner for the city of Los Angeles, where she worked on current and long-range planning and performance management initiatives here in LA. She specializes in equitable community development, inclusive outreach, and organizational innovation for large metro areas. She's very, very dedicated to changing the field of planning inside and out through her work. So thank you so much for joining us today and guiding our conversation on this important topic. I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. I'd like to remind everybody that we'll save time at the end for our guests to address any questions that folks may have, but I would encourage everyone to post questions in the chat throughout the webinar today. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can at the end. With that, I'll pass it off to Nina to kick off our conversation. Thank you, Nina, for joining.
Hello, no problem. Good morning to you. It is it is noon. It's afternoon here in Chicago, Central Time. As Christoph mentioned, I did used to live in LA. I actually am a native of Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, as you can see from my background, and went to the University of Southern California for my master's in planning, which I'm sure a lot of people on this webinar are either familiar with the program or graduated from there. So Trojans, right? And I have, I really miss LA. I was on the board for the APA Los Angeles and APA California. I have many fond memories in helping to change and shape how APA California works. And then also working in the planning field in Los Angeles. I used to work for Transit Neighborhood Plans when I was at the city of Los Angeles, and then now working in Chicago. My firm holds the contract working with CDOT for Vision Zero Chicago, as well as our rideshare program, Divvy, the expansion to the south and west side. So I'm really excited here to have our two guests here with me today. They are amazing, and I can't wait to jump into the conversation. But first, let me introduce them to you. So we have KeAndra Cylear Dodds, who is the Executive Officer of Equity and Race at Los Angeles Metro. So for over a decade, KeAndra has dedicated her career to creation and preservation of affordable housing, improving access to transit, economic opportunities, and developing policies that foster social equity. Prior to her role at Metro, she worked as the manager of preservation at Los Angeles County Development Authority, where she oversaw all the county's affordable housing preservation and home ownership programs. She also led development of several tenant protection ordinances. KeAndra also previously served as the Senior Director of Policy and Special Initiatives at Enterprise Community Partners, a national nonprofit, and as the Transportation and Housing Deputy for Los Angeles County Supervisor Hilda Solis. As a deputy, she focused on issues related to transportation, land use, affordable housing, and LGBT rights. Finally, before switching to a focus on policy and government, she worked as a staff attorney at Western Center of Law and Poverty in Los Angeles. So welcome. Our second panelist is John Yee. He is the Executive Director of Los Angeles Walks. Prior to joining Los Angeles Walks in 2019, John was the Advocacy Director for the American Lung Association in California, where he worked on strong tobacco control and air quality policies. After the Lung Association, John also served as the lead organizer who trained tobacco control coalitions throughout the state. He worked to bring smoke-free ordinances to over a dozen different cities, fighting back against secondhand smoke and big tobacco's efforts to target low-income communities and communities of color. John also served as the interim national director for Parent Revolution, an education and social justice nonprofit. In this role, he led parent organizing campaigns in Texas, Oklahoma, Indiana, and Ohio. He received his master's degree at Georgetown University and his bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan, Go Blue. He is a brother of Pi Alpha Phi and speaks Korean and Russian, and he loves to cook. So thank you both for joining me. Wow, like just even getting those bios and trying to get them down because you have so much experience between the both of you. That was a task and a half. And so I'm excited to jump into these questions. So clearly one of the reasons that we're here, when Everything Breaks series started with, this little pandemic that we have going around the globe, no big deal, and so over the last few months, as we've seen how the pandemic has been progressing through our cities and different communities, we've seen how ridership on public transit has plummeted, right? As some parts of the economy reopen, more and more people are trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to get where I'm going? How am I going to make sure I put my safety first? And in some instances, we have essential workers who just don't have that choice. So in your opinion, what specific vulnerabilities and perhaps failures of current transportation policy and investment have come to the surface as a result of this current pandemic and crisis?
I guess I'll go first. Well, first, thanks for the introduction, and thanks to APA California for hosting this and inviting me to join the conversation. I think, as far as vulnerabilities, one, I want to start just by saying, while most transportation agencies have seen ridership plummet, what's been interesting is that LA County saw the least decrease in ridership, which I think really speaks to who is using our system, who our core riders are, and how dependent they are on our system, and especially with bus as opposed to rail. We've seen the smallest decrease. With that said, as an agency at Metro, we've had to adjust and move very quickly. And I think there's three vulnerabilities that stand out for me with all of that work. And so one is our inability to, in real time, track our ridership, which initially has made it hard to kind of track overcrowding and make the adjustments necessary to make sure that as we adjusted our service, people weren't experiencing overcrowding, which of course, given this public health crisis, is a major concern for us. So we've had to evolve and think of and explore other ways, utilizing our different complaint lines, social media, et cetera, to learn and understand those trends in overcrowding, and then be able to add capacity, make adjustments, et cetera. But that's something that we struggle with, to be able to move quickly. And then the second thing I would say is our ability to communicate those service changes. So while we have our traditional methods, we have our blogs, our different websites, our email listservs, not everyone has access to that. And that's not the best way to connect to everyone that truly needs to know. And so we've had to expand the different ways that we communicate, reach out through CBOs, reach out through our board of directors, through their listservs, just really expand the way we try to get that information out to people so that they can still get to work, they can still do the things they need to do to make those essential trips and be able to do it in a reasonable time and with the least amount of inconvenience to their trips. And then I think the third piece, and this has been interesting because, as we've had to we've reduced our service levels, which also means we've had fewer trips and fewer buses in general. It's led to more complaints from people about wheelchairs being passed up because the buses have no space. So because of the changes we've made, it's made it such that with less buses, it's easier but you have some of the same number of people trying to use the same buses. It's more of a challenge to respond. So what's interesting though, we've adjusted with our access services, which traditionally you have to submit a request to use access services 24 hours in advance. So now we actually provide same day service to account for that need and to be able to make sure that we're meeting those needs. But again, I go back to the communication piece, because we got to make sure people are getting that information, because that is a major change that can help support people that are in wheelchairs that need our service. But we just have to make sure that information gets to those folks and so that they can take those trips. So those are three of the things that I would highlight.
Yeah, thank you. And also, I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you all. Yeah, I'm really excited to share a little bit about what we've been experiencing as a nonprofit. Just a little bit of a background, Los Angeles Walks is an advocacy organization. Our bread and butter is community organizing. We partner with local communities throughout Los Angeles and work with them on securing some really basic safe street infrastructure like crosswalks, curb ramps, flat sidewalks, stop signs. And as many of folks on this call would probably know, and if you live in LA, getting those kind of things are incredibly difficult. So it requires a great deal of organizing. And so doing this work, I would say something that we've seen, we'll go into, I guess, systems that are broken, I'm sure later in the conversation, but one overarching issue that we've seen is there seems to be a real lack of an approach when it comes to transportation in the world of COVID-19. And, early on in the pandemic, there was a lot of messaging, a lot of rhetoric out there about essential workers, protecting essential workers, making sure that, they had safe routes to their employment centers and home, that were safe, that their families were safe. But then with all that rhetoric that was sort of bubbling to the top, especially among policymakers and activists alike, was there sort of an accompanying policy that sort of supported their transportation to work? And I would argue, and LA isn't the only one, but a lot of cities have sort of bungled that. And you still see that now. There really isn't a comprehensive idea of what essential workers are and how do we get them to and from work safe. And I think that question is even more like poignant now because as in a strange way, we're sort of opening back up. The reality is a lot of folks that we consider non-essential workers, people work in office jobs, a lot of people on this call, people like me, we can still stay home and work from home. But there are people now who are being told to go back to their workplaces. And so the pool of essential workers have sort of almost expanded. And are we right now really considering are we creating a transportation system that sort of serves that? And so that's one area that I'm seeing a lot lacking. And I think a really good example of that is Slow Streets. And I'll just be honest about it. I know a lot of cities have been trying to roll out versions of Slow Streets. And for those who are on the call might not know, but this is broadly speaking, an effort by cities across the country to provide a walkable, pedestrian, and bike-friendly spaces within the city. And so by either restricting cars from even coming in or reducing traffic so it's a little more safer. But it's an idea that's caught on with a lot of cities. And on the surface level, it makes sense. People want to walk when they're social distancing, but are we looking at it through an equity lens? If we're going to spend city resources when things are already strapped right now, are we spending these resources in areas where there is a high need, where there is high injuries, where there are communities of color, where there are essential workers, right? And so I think that is, it's been disappointing a little bit. I know the city has, at least LA has been trying to put an equity lens on it, but I think it's just indicative of a larger systems issue we have, which we'll go into a little bit later of how we make decisions in LA when it comes to city planning. But definitely, I think a lack of a uniform policy of what transportation looks like during COVID is something that's really lacking that I think we still need to work on.
Absolutely. My gosh, you guys both bring up really great points and some of the same issues that we're experiencing here in Chicago. So clearly where these issues have come up all across the country, a lot of our city centers are experiencing some of the same issues, especially surrounding equity with society's most vulnerable, right? And so for so long, because we were just trekking along, we were like, oh, everything works, and then when everything breaks, we're like, oh, snap, now we have to start thinking about how do we communicate? How do we, not everybody wants to get on the Zoom, or not everybody has access to social media or broadband internet. How do we access those folks? And so I was laughing or smiling when John was talking about the Slow Streets, because these are the same conversations we're having here in Chicago of like, oh, great idea. Implementation could use some work, so it's just, culminating all those things. So as you're highlighting a lot of these kind of exposing these failures or these kind of like, in some cases, hypocrisies of transportation planning, right? We say one thing and then we actively do another, which feeds into a system that perpetuates bias and anti-Blackness and racism and all these other isms. With like ongoing protests, clearly as a response to the killing of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer, and so many, right? This is not a new issue. It just happens to have come to the forefront, one, because we're in a pandemic and a lot of people are at home and paying more attention. But these are issues that our communities, and I'm saying that as a Black woman from Detroit, like our communities have been talking about for a very long time, right? And so as we kind of put a spotlight on that, and it also includes like looking at the inequities in our transportation systems, or how we as people, as POC, Black people or Indigenous people, are politicized just by accessing public space, right, which includes transportation. So what are some strategies that planners and community activists should be looking at to make sure that transportation justice and equity are incorporated into decision-making in a transparent and meaningful way that really creates change and really makes people feel safe? John, if you want to start this one, like we can go back and forth.
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, my initial gut reaction is overhaul the entire system of how we consider community engagement.
Burn it down.
And, yeah, I mean that applies not only to transit agencies, but also to consulting groups. You know, and as a nonprofit, you know, a lot of groups reach out to us, especially in the private sector and consulting and these agencies, about how they can do better in community engagement. And to be honest, I think community engagement is become industrialized in a way in this sort of sector of this professional field. And so I think we need to really reevaluate that. And my initial reaction to your question is just burn it down and start from the beginning. And I think that includes reforming the way we organize, the way we structure our cities, it includes charter reform. So I know it's a lot down the line. So my more realistic answer would be invest in community organizers. That's what I would say. Invest in your local nonprofits. I mean, this is kind of selfish, but invest in organizations like Los Angeles Walks that has relationships with communities, and not just a relationship that's been a year-long, but years-long relationship, right? That we've been there, we know the community, and that we're partners and genuine partners. And so I think that's another way of doing it. But I think really reevaluating not only how you do communication, but also the resources you're spending. I can tell you agencies and consulting groups are not spending nearly enough money on paying not only folks like me, but also community members for their opinions and their thoughts.
Absolutely.
And so definitely spending more money is something that I think is crying out for a need right now. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would definitely second everything that John shared about community engagement and building those relationships and giving it the time and the resources that it deserves. I would also add, I think it's really important to be clear about what we mean when we say transportation justice and equity. I find that a lot of people throw the words around, and in some ways, even throw around equity just to kind of support something they want that really isn't about equity. And so I think it's really important to be very clear and be very specific. Also being specific about the issue at hand. If it's an issue about Black people or Asian people, be specific. Don't say it's about people of color, because the more specificity you have, the better you're able to actually address the problem and understand the reason for the barrier or the disparity, et cetera. But too often, you know, whether it's because people are trying to be PC or trying to kind of skirt around the issue, we just kind of lump it all together. And also the difference between equity and diversity. Sometimes those get confused, and they're very different. And it's important to talk about when we are talking about diversity and celebrating our differences and the benefits of embracing all of that, versus when we're trying to target disparities and reduce and eliminate them. And that's a key differentiation that needs to be addressed, I think, at the agency level and at the community level as we do this work. And then the last thing that I'll add is that we need to have broader conversations about the benefits and harms of our decisions. Oftentimes we're just thinking about the benefits. Who can this help? What is is it accessible to all, et cetera? But there are real harms that come, especially when you don't think about those harms. They can be exacerbated. They can create bigger problems. And so if we, at the beginning of our discussions, as a part of the engagement, we aim to understand what might be the negative impact and how we could prevent that, how we can adjust so that we don't create those or we minimize those, then that also is another way that we can further advance equity and racial justice.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as somebody who's worked in the public sector, so like my entire career working for the city of Los Angeles and then working for the city of Chicago, working in the public sector and understanding some of the limitations, the real limitations, and then the ones that are created just out of bureaucracy, right? And working around those, I think is super important. So like to tie both of your comments together, one thing that's super important is for people who do work in the public sector or in these decision-making capabilities to rely on the community more heavily and then pay them for their time. Like that should be in your budget, built in, like as a consultant, even now, everything that we do is built in equity. And so it's like, if we're asking for community members, which we're always asking for community members to come to the table, we're building in, okay, $100 gift cards, vouchers for free rides on Divvy. Like, we're building that in because we want to make sure that that relationship is not just one way, not just like, oh, we as the public entity are always coming to the community and asking these questions and going away for months on it. And then, you know, like the trust is never going to be built that way. And so, yeah, I really enjoy, you know, how you guys are kind of bringing that together and bringing that to the forefront. A lot more of us need to think through that, because like those inequities that we're not seeing could be brought forth by one having a more diverse decision-making table, right? So we're all at this table, right? But we all have different perspectives. So if there's nobody who understands differently abled people, right, at the table, then when you think through a decision like you were referencing earlier with Metro, you're going to think, oh no, we're missing out on people who need to use wheelchairs, right? So like having that perspective and having those community relationships are super important. So, you know, over time, we've been thinking about how to approach equity, diversity, inclusion in our work as transportation planners or as planners in general. There's been lots of talk, especially with the civil unrest that has been happening in all of our cities across the nation. I mean, every state has had major Black Lives Matter demonstrations in at least 17 countries. So this is something that is important and heightened right now. And for a lot of people, including myself, we're calling for the defundment of the police, which means the limitation of the scope of work that police go after, like as in just violent crime. So like if somebody gets into a fender bender, you don't need to send an armed cop. If somebody gets into a nonviolent domestic dispute, you don't need to send an armed police officer. If your house get robbed and the assailant is gone by the time you get back, do you really need an armed police officer to take that? So it's rethinking how we do policing in this country, right? Because we've defunded public health and defunded public education in many ways. And so I just wanted to give that explainer for those in the audience who may not know or may misunderstand what defunding the police may actually mean, because I think there's a little bit of discourse about what that means. So in this time of thinking about, okay, eliminating some of the line items that the police handle and taking that money that we could be saving from not giving them militarized weapons and equipment and putting that back into the community and putting that back into the city budget to be allocated in other spaces. I want to know what your personal opinion is about what do you think about defunding the police in general, and should that money be allocated to transportation investment, and what would that look like for you in a best case scenario?
So I think, well, one, I'm supportive. I think, you know, for all the reasons you shared, I mean, we need to rethink what this looks like and how we could better address the key issues that are at hand in a different way that is not using the police, not using armed individuals, et cetera. I think, as I think about where the reinvestment should go, I go back to the two key areas that I've worked in, which I think, you know, transportation and housing in particular. Mm-hmm. Those are the two greatest costs that impact most households. They impact other life incomes, whether it's your access to schools, access to jobs. I mean, you have to have an address to be able to apply, and you need a reliable way to get there. Also your health outcomes. So they impact your life in many ways. And I think when I think about LA County, it's interesting because transportation is seen as a public good, and accordingly, it's been better funded than housing, but it's been better funded when it's framed in a way of increasing like choice riders and increasing rail, right? And so I think we have to do more investments in our bus service and supporting the needs of our core riders and expanding and increasing that service. I think as far as housing, it's not typically seen as a public good. And so there's less willingness to fund it and to support it. I think until recently, but the homeless crisis and how it's become so big that it is every community in the county, let alone the state, is impacted. And so I think people have shifted to this place where they're willing to support homeless services, but they're still not willing to support housing, not in their community, not, you know, like, so I think we really have to better fund both transportation, specifically bus operations, but also housing, and figure out a way to do it, because we'll never solve the homeless crisis, we'll never solve this affordable housing crisis unless we kind of think bigger and do more investment in those areas. So I think those are the two that, if we're able to better address those, we could help with other aspects of like life outcomes and other aspects of community development and impact. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, first off, thank you, Nina, for explaining defund the police. I think a lot of people misunderstand that. And so I'm all for it. I think there's too much money going there. And I think you would be hard to like try to argue otherwise. I think if you just look at the numbers. And I would just say, I mean, just to also add, you know, it's interesting because I live in Koreatown, and it was around my age that my father, when he first immigrated from Korea to America, that he saw the LA civil unrest, and it was around my age he saw it. So it's almost like a full circle of what's been happening.
Wow.
Full circle in one way, but I think definitely having conversations with my father, really challenging conversations, I think really show that we've grown, but there's so much more left to do. So I'm encouraged by that, but not satisfied. Now, as for, I think, money when it comes to law enforcement, I mean, also, there's a lot of money from Vision Zero money that goes to LAPD, right? And, you know, we work with LAPD, especially on issues around traffic violence and victims of traffic violence and car crashes. And so I think law enforcement has a role when it comes to certain issues, but I think they're overstretched in one way. And I think Vision Zero, which is a program that LA has. For those who don't know, Vision Zero is a policy effort to reduce traffic violence. And in LA, it's to reduce it down to 0 by 2025, which is pretty soon. And so, yeah, if I don't know how much LAPD has done on Vision Zero. I haven't seen much to come out. The city in general has not done much, just to be frank with everyone. But one sort of example I'll bring up is LAPD still jaywalks, tickets jaywalkers in LA. I don't like using that word, but jaywalkers. And for me, that is so asinine. You can't have a Vision Zero program as a city on one hand and spend money on reducing pedestrian violence and deaths, but then on the other hand, ticket pedestrians who are trying to navigate a city that is incredibly misdesigned, misbuilt for pedestrians and for walkers. And so, yeah, I think that is just a glaring example of, you know, we have this rhetoric when it comes to reducing pedestrian deaths, but are we following up with policies and actual action?
Right.
And I would argue in a lot of areas we're not. And that's not just in transportation, I think that's in a lot of other areas. And so to the final question of like where we reinvest, I am always KeAndra, home ownership and housing. And for me, I definitely would want more money in transportation, but I think one issue that I see is just the lack of people owning homes and the lack of people having a stake in their community. And so when gentrification happens, when development happens, they're not the recipients, they're not the beneficiaries of that. And so whatever we can do to keep our communities intact and build ownership and wealth, I think is gonna be a priority. So if there's any way to divert money into that, that's where I would go. And also the lack of home ownership is also an ill that really messes up in transportation too. And so I think those issues are very connected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think you guys hit it on the head as far as like, well, transportation, and KeAndra, I think you make a really great case for your core ridership is taking buses. When I lived in Los Angeles, I lived by the Coliseum all 7 years. I lived in Los Angeles. I never used my car. I had a car for 7 years. I never used it. I took the bus almost every day. I hardly ever took the light rail, even though I lived right down the street from the Expo line. So it's like, you know, it's trendy, or that's where the money, or that's where people are writing these grants at the state level saying like, oh, light rail is the future and this is what's going to happen. But are you actually speaking to the riders that you already have and getting to their needs? Like that is true equity instead of not instead of investing, because not saying that there's not a place for light rail. Of course there's a place for light rail, but really like what is the end goal here, right? Are we speaking to our ridership as it is? And then also like, yes, we want to grow it, but at what cost to our core ridership? And just thinking through that. And then also thinking about, yes, investment, whether you want to own a home or not, I think community ownership is important, right? So whether you live in a building that's owned by somebody who's dedicated to the community and willing to stick up for renters and be there for renters if you choose not to own a home, or if you want to be able to own a home, having the ability to do that. And so many people that are displaced into homelessness in Los Angeles are Los Angeles natives, which I find to be the most heartbreaking part of the homeless crisis in California in general, right? These are people that are born and bred in California and can't afford to live in their own home. And so I think in a combination of like housing policies and transit policies and making sure that there's no loopholes for development. And as somebody who has worked for cities, I've seen both cities that I've worked for, I've seen loopholes in both areas where it's like, oh, we want to leave it open just in case, right? But leaving it open just in case, again, causes a negative effect that we may not have anticipated. And so I think that's something that for the audience, for us to really think about as we are policymakers, we have to take every decision that we make into very, very seriously, because we are impacting people's lives. It's not just words on a page. These are, you know, I mean, ordinances I've written, I'm like, oh, that's going to be law for the long term. And so, yeah, it's really important to really focus on these things as we think about where to reallocate resources if defunding the police, hopefully, comes into fruition. And in Los Angeles, I will say that the mayor has committed to the numbers are iffy, $100 to $150 million to reallocate it. So we'll see what happens. I'll be watching very closely. Chicago has not made the same commitment. So there's that. So, you know, I want to take a step back and really get to talking about you two personally. So yes, we are professionals, we're urban planners, we're transportation specialists, you know, we're advocates in this transportation world, but also there is a piece of you as your core self, right? Like, I am a Black woman and I come into this role and I come into this profession as a Black woman. And again, because the profession perpetuates inequities, and that's just institutional inequities, right? Since the beginning of beginning of zoning and land use and transportation, we have been perpetuating inequities in society, and now we're trying to, as a philosophy, and as we work through it, trying to reel those things back, right? And so, like, how do your personal identities, you know, show up and affect your work or your perspectives about your work? And what kind of personal challenges do you encounter? I know I encounter them. I have to take a deep breath almost every day when I'm dealing with whether different clients, or, you know, I hear those microaggressions, or I hear those things. It's like, oh, they're not going to do that, or we don't need to talk to that community group because they're not important enough. They don't have political will, or what have you. So I just want to get to know a little bit more about like how you show up in this work. John, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll Yeah, this is a really good question. And I feel everyone is sort of, well, I don't want to speak for everyone, but a lot of people are going through this sort of journey themselves right now about figuring out your role and your place. And I'll just be blunt, you know, I am a Asian male working in a field that, and working in an organization, and predominantly most of the partners that we have are Spanish-speaking Latino communities. And so I, in my role in this space, have to figure out when can I step up and then when do I step back. And I think people find that difficult, and I know I find that difficult too. And so I think understanding what space you occupy and how much of that space you should be occupying is something that I'm constantly learning, and that in this moment is really putting into focus. As for being Asian American in this work, you know, I gotta say, when it comes to transportation justice issues, there's not a lot of Asian American voices or perspective in it. And that is not, and I would say that is not because there's a lack of Asian American participation in this. You know, I do a story that I often bring up is, I'm active locally, politically here in LA. And so I do a lot of canvassing. So I go door to door, you know, drop leaflets and go to people's apartments. And living in K-Town, there's a lot of density. And so you end up going to a lot of apartment buildings. And you could go to like the wealthiest apartments, you could go to the most low-income apartments. But in the garage, and a lot of Koreans live here, you'll find consistently everyone drives a BMW, a Lexus, or a very expensive car. And the reason for that is in our community, it's a sign of success, at least for the first generation. And so there's also a lot of transit users, but they're stigmatized even within the APIA community about what wealth is and what the success looks like. And so I think there's a lot of hurdles even within our own community about talking about justice and transportation. And so I think there's a lot of work that even I need to do within my own community and really uplifting some of this stuff and getting more of our voices into this work. So I would say that. And at the end of it, you know, I mean, I always speak into a panel. I can't really see everyone on this group. So I see two Black females in front of me. So I feel a little silly saying this, but you know, there is nothing qualitatively different from this moment than 6 months ago. We just see more videos. That's it. We've just seen more of the same shit on our social media, and the political wave just hit a tipping point. But qualitatively, the world is not that much different. And I think we're all asking ourselves, why are we feeling this way when 6 months ago we didn't feel this way? And not everyone, I think there's communities that have been feeling this and asking themselves for generations. So again, I'm not speaking to everyone on this, but I think people need to lean into that discomfort and need to lean into that and ask themselves that every day. And I ask myself that every day. And not just people, but industries need to ask themselves every day. Like if I'm a corporation, I'm putting up a statement on BLM, why am I doing it? You know, why am I doing this now as opposed to 6 months ago? And really like lean into that. And I think if we lean into that as organizations, as institutions, as governments, I think we'll have better outcomes. But yeah, that's a little bit, I guess, what I will share.
Thank you. KeAndra?
So, okay, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. I identify as a Black queer woman, and I think my identity has, like, I've always been raised to kind of be conscious about my identity, especially when in public. And I think, it's interesting because I've been reflecting a lot, and as a teenager, I kind of push back, like, oh, why do you care what other people think? But then I think about moments where so many times I was reminded of my identity out in public and reminded of the need to be conscious and the need to protect myself, essentially. So one thing that just came to mind recently, a friend, she posted this experience that we both shared as her first example of her encounter with racism. We were in her neighborhood. She's a white girl in the central west end of St. Louis, which is a really wealthy area. And we were riding bikes down the street, and another white teenager yelled from her balcony, "Hey, this is a private neighborhood. You need to get out." And she yelled back, "We live here." I didn't live there, but she said we lived here. And that moment always stood out to me as this time of like, I was riding, felt carefree, like having fun. And then I was hit with this, "Hey, you don't belong here. You shouldn't be doing that here." Like that. And, that wasn't the first time for me. We didn't talk about it in that moment. I recently had a conversation with her, but I'm just constantly reminded of the times where I, you can't be in public without being reminded of your identity and how people perceive you. And especially when you're perceived as a threat, even when you're just regular, like riding a bike.
Absolutely.
So I think flash forward to this role, I take all of those experiences kind of help me kind of fuel my passion in my work, like what we're fighting for, and be able to better identify with the people we're fighting for, because I am like the people we're fighting for. My family is my friends, those who are most in need. I grew up in a low income background as well in St. Louis, single parent household, etc. So, I think all of that helps me stay grounded in the work. And also, it's easy within the agency for people to kind of see me as someone that, I'm not completely new to Metro. I've worked with Metro from different kind of positions. And so I think some people kind of see how I've navigated the system and feel comfortable saying inappropriate things about the communities we're trying to serve in my presence. And it's hurtful, it's painful, and it's hard to grapple with that. And so, finding the balance between speaking up and calling them out on it, but also building relationships to make changes so that one, they understand the problems with what they're saying, but two, that doesn't trickle into the decisions that we're making, or we figure out how to undo that kind of learned way of thinking about an approach to communities, and especially in the context of community engagement. So it's, I say all that to say, I think my identity helps to ground me. It fuels my passion, but then it also makes me a little bit more vulnerable in this work. And it can be emotionally draining to have to deal with all of that. And so, I've been more recently trying to figure out just how to, be gentle with myself, give myself the space to be able to keep doing this work, because it's so important. I care so much, but I can't let it like kind of ruin me personally, like that's a heavy weight to carry. I think that's something
Absolutely.
So many of us, women of color, queer people, like experience in doing this work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you both make really great points. And one of the reasons that, I wanted to ask this question is because over time, as I've been in this profession, I didn't wake up when I was little, like, oh, I'm going to be urban planner, right? I don't think any of us did. Most of us probably didn't, right? It was a career field that kind of fell in my lap. And I was like, oh, this is how I enact change. Like when I was growing up on Detroit's east side and going to the suburbs for school because they had a better school system, the Detroit public school system, I was on a bus for an hour going up and down 8 Mile and seeing how just the built environment changed from my neighborhood to the neighborhood that I went to school with. And that stuck with me. I didn't have a word for it. I didn't have a description for it, but it was like, they have parks and they have green space and they have, houses and cul-de-sacs. Not even saying that I want to live in a cul-de-sac now, but they had those things. And I knew that my neighborhood didn't, but I also had a sense of belonging where I was from, right? That I didn't have in that other neighborhood that I wanted to see, like, how can I make these two things mesh? And I think now that, and you all can speak to this, if over time, what I do now is I just start showing up as my full self. I think when I first started in this profession, I was, honestly, professionalism is just another word for giving into white supremacy, or what whiteness is, what whiteness decides is appropriate for us to do in a workspace, right? And so I would wear my hair straight. I would, not wear bright colors, not wear bow lips, not wear big hoops. And over time, what I started to do is take my power back and say, like, I'm not going to give in. And that's a privilege in within itself. I will say that to the audience. That is a privilege within itself. And, because a lot of us, if we wear our hair natural and show up to work and get fired, most of our states do not have protections for us, And so, but what people always ask me is like, oh, Nina, you've really gotten your confidence, or you've really grown into this person, and you walk into a room and you capture people's attention. And I think it's a mixture of, one, I've always had to do more to get less, right? So I have my certifications. I know how to do land use and zoning. I know how to do community organizing. I know how to do outreach and engagement. I can do pretty much anything y'all can do times 2, because I've had to learn how to do those things. And then 2, because I've decided that I'm going to know what I talk about no matter who I'm talking to, I've allowed myself to wear my hair big, wear the hoops, wear the bold lips, because even if you judge me, I'm going to be able to spar with you in this environment and tell you why what we're doing is not the correct way to do it, or why there's another perspective, because I've worked so hard to get that way. And it's exhausting and it's stressful, but I think that's a one way that as Black people or Indigenous people or POC, like, we can take our power back in these workspaces is by showing up as our full selves whenever we can. And like I said, it's a privilege to be able to do that, but taking those tiny steps to say, like, no, I'm gonna wear, I'm gonna get bright red hair. Now, a white woman touched my braids the time I had bright red hair, but that's a whole nother story. And so I want to go into one of my last questions. So thank you so much for sharing your personal experiences in this industry. And I hope that, the audience kind of learns, different ways to really show up as your full self, because the work product will be better if you are able and allowed to show up to work as your full being with all your experiences and all your flaws. And now that we're in this movement of heightened awareness of racial injustice, and equity is like on everybody's mind, equity is the buzzword. I wish I could like delete it, but not the meaning, but just the word. Oh my gosh. A lot of different voices have been elevated, and, we've had some victories, we've had some cautious, we're cautious about, our optimism around some of the victories that we've had, but we have had a few, right? Like I just mentioned with the mayor's budget and reallocating some of those things. How can we uplift our work, like this work, this equity, this diversity, this inclusion? How can we uplift this work in our everyday, like whether I'm an assistant planner, and I think, oh, I'm just a paper pusher, right? Or I'm an executive director and I have a little bit more pull. How can we, what advice can we give to folks about how to really bring these themes into their work and make sure that, specifically with transportation systems and building strong communities, that we can focus on the most vulnerable, like the communities that are most vulnerable? Like, what are some things that you think people should think about or practice in their everyday work? KeAndra, do you want to start?
Yeah, just thinking about that. It's a really good question. I think I mean, on one hand, definitely starting with educating yourself and speaking up. It's, that's such a crucial piece, not relying on people of color to explain things to you, but taking the time to like invest and put in the time for you
Yeah.
to watch, some videos. There's a lot of material out there that can help.
So much. So
Um,
much.
but also, sharing the burden of speaking up when you see that, this, there's clearly going to be an inequitable outcome here, or this is pretty problematic language to use in this like marketing campaign, or we need to go out and engage the community and that's not happening. Like, speaking up and not just putting the burden on your equity officer or community members, etc. I think it's also really important, and this kind of goes to the education piece, but understanding like what are the disparities that exist and the why, because we won't be able to solve those issues unless we understand like the root causes. Otherwise we just exacerbating the problems, the gaps, etc. So like utilizing data, but also meaningful community engagement, because we need that to ground truth that data and figure out what is the right data that we're looking at. And those are key pieces for any process, whether it's your budget process, you're planning a project, etc. We need to put in the time and the work to focus on those two pieces. And I don't think we do that enough. We look at data, but in transportation, very specific ridership, kind of your traditional safety. Like we look at very specific KPI related to funding and other aspects, but there's a different type of data that we need to look at when we're talking about disparities and understanding those. So working on it. It's a process. It won't come overnight. It's not something we've done historically. If we had, then we wouldn't be here.
We would be here. Exactly.
Figuring out how we can
progress.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. For me, I would say, I mean, everything about community engagement that KeAndra spoke about 100% on that. And other ways I think we can respond to this moment, as a community organizer, storytelling is important. Just for me and the work that we do, it's actually central to what we do, being able to tell a story and be able to really move people's hearts. And so one thing I think the way we all can respond to this moment is continue to tell stories. But I agree with the point before, it shouldn't be all on the shoulders of Black men and Black women on POCs. I think we all have stories to tell, but not only telling stories, but also listening to stories, I think is important. So whether it's reading a book, whether it's following an author on Twitter, whether it's, I think just being proactive about listening to more stories that you don't know, you haven't heard of, I think is a responsibility that we all should be taking up seriously right now. We need to seriously educate ourselves. I think there's no excuse for that. I think second, what I would say is what I said earlier is like just leaning into that discomfort. It's easy for us to look at movies right now that take place in the 60s and think about that generation like, oh my God, how could they think like that? How could they talk like that? I will tell you, in 40 years, they're gonna look back at this generation and be like the same damn thing. And so my question to everyone here is, do we want to be in that lump? Do we want the future generation to lump us in that group of seeing people like that are just so backwards? And so I think, again, leaning into that comfort individually, but also as organizations, figuring out why am I feeling this way when I didn't feel this way 6-7 months ago, and being honest with yourself. So I think those are a few ways we can respond to this moment. And then I guess since I'm in a Zoom room full of planners and people in the professional world, I don't want to lose this opportunity. But when this is over and y'all go back to your work, I would say invest in your local nonprofits, invest in your local community leaders, and compensate them, pay them, for their opinions. So I would just really push folks to do that.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you so much for both of your answers. That's all of our facilitated questions for now. We have about 10 minutes. And so I'm looking in the Q&A, and I also see a question in the chat. So I'm going to quickly look to see which questions. Okay, so here's one question. Are there good leadership training opportunities for people in the public sector to better incorporate equity and communication into their work, or to help elevate Black and Brown people into top decision-making positions to help address these issues? Do either of you know of any programs or things that people should be doing? I know we said a lot, clearly we referenced earlier, like educating yourself, but are there any formal programs that either of you know?
I mean, I think a go-to is often GARE, which is the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. I think that's one. I think there are many other options that speak more specifically to community engagement. There's also been a lot of like recent panels and whatnot. I don't have any specifics off the top of my head right now, but I know there's been a lot of just an increase in conversations, especially with community engagement right now when you can't.
Absolutely.
And so there's additional barriers there. But I think Gary, something worth exploring, because I think it does a great job of kind of helping it ground conversations in racial equity to like normalize the conversation and figure out how you move towards then operationalizing. And so, yeah, that's one resource if your agency has the resources to put behind it. And then, yeah, I could send a follow-up email if we're emailing the participants on some of the recent webinars and articles that have been written about bettering community engagement.
I would just add, if you are finding like a need for that kind of services, I'm sure they're great. I'm sure there's good ones out there, but also I would also ask, what can you change internally where you don't need to have those kind of services? Can you change leadership so it has more people of color, it has more diversity, it has LGBT folks in it? You know, can you change HR protocol in your hiring process? I think there's so many things internally that we need to explore. Yeah. How are we compensating our employees? How are we hiring and firing our employees? What do we consider value in this organization? So I think there's so many mechanical things inside that reinforce the system where you can bring in outside consultants to do a talk and do trainings, but unless you rip it out from the root, yeah, I think you need to really ask yourselves, what is internally going on that we can fix?
Absolutely.
That's not to play down on the other programs. So that's not what I meant. I think these services exist too for a good reason.
No, it's a mix of both. I agree with you. I think speaking from my personal experience, when I worked for the city of Los Angeles, I was in the performance management unit. The city of Los Angeles has the largest planning department in the nation, 400 employees, right? About 400 employees. So I was in charge of creating an internal training program for all 400 employees, which included diversity and equity inclusion work. And so we were able to kind of standardize some of those things. Now, since I've left, the programs have gone on, so I can't speak to how they stand right now, but I think for the city of Los Angeles, considering other cities around the nation that were not doing similar programs, we're not doing similar, like, you know, how are we even tracking? The performance management unit for the city of Los Angeles also tracks who's getting promoted. What are the races of those folks? Who, you know, like, who are we hiring? What are the races of those folks? You know, what are their qualifications? And is there a gap in how where we're hiring? You know, are we getting, if we're too late by the time they're in grad school or in college, are we going to high schools and saying, hey, this is a career for you and we want diverse applicants? And so now in my work at Muse, we've also started to do like internal trainings for different organizations. So whether you be a public agency or a private firm, we also do trainings and help organizations kind of actualize and realize, like, okay, what are our attainable goals? What kind of improvements do we need to be making internally? Because again, if your house is not in order, your policies are going to show that. And so it's really, really important. And then you can always, you know, APA, for what it's worth. I mean, not everybody, clearly if you're here today, you pay attention to APA, but there are a wealth of especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are not necessarily built into the system of APA, but they do offer different courses and different resources for that type of training. So I just implore you to like try to find something. There's not necessarily a program specifically for planning in these things that I know of, but there are several people, especially in Chicago, creating fellowships that are speaking to exactly what you're talking to. They just haven't come to fruition yet. But I think we're in an atmosphere of opportunity where a lot of these programs and a lot of these needs that we're seeing will actually come into realization over time. So hold tight and until then, you can always reach out to any of us for more detailed, you know, resources and things like that. So I think I can do one more question. So I'm going to try to do a quick one. So this one's kind of short. How can we move out of transactional relationships between public agencies and community-based organizations to a more ongoing relationship that can grow over time? John, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I have a solution for this, and it might sound crazy. I've never actually shared this with this many people, but I feel like the city should have a department of organizing, to be honest. There should be a dedicated arm of the government of the city that is dedicated to maintaining and developing relationships with communities on a year-long basis, on a continual basis, so that if there's issues of health, issues of transportation, issues of education. There's already someone who understands the community, not preferably, but should be from the community, that is not only getting paid from the city, but being able to really be able to understand the community and report back to the city and develop that kind of rapport. So I feel like the way we do transportation in LA is so broken. And I think the way we do a lot of other city functions is so siloed and broken off, that if we can have a dedicated department, committed to developing these relationships on a continual basis, so that we're not just flying in and flying out, but we're being genuine, and we actually understand what that community needs are because we've been there. So I think that's one way we can sort of fix the system. But I know that takes like a charter reform. It takes a lot of work, but we're gonna go for it.
There are some cities who have that model. So like the city of LA has a planning department, has an external affairs that kind of has that function, but not as radical as I think what you're saying. I believe the city of San Francisco also has something similar, but doesn't go as far as what you're saying. So there are some models there that I've learned about over time. I think that, and Baltimore, the city of Baltimore actually also has an arm like that, but again, not in the same vein, right? So it's like this, they're putting their toe in the water of like, okay, like we're a government agency and we really want to be in the community. So, like we're kind of doing it, but not 100%. So there's models, but like, I think we could really take it there if with some foresight and some leadership.
Yeah. I mean, I'd agree. I think that would be a really interesting model. I think, in the context, obviously Metro is countywide, and we have 88 cities in our county. And so, sometimes with community engagement, people get meeting fatigue because you have this city going, this city, this.
Absolutely.
So something that's more coordinated that allows us to build the relationships and have like key like points of contact, but that also helps us kind of combine our efforts. One, because it would help us like, as far as planning, to be able to better coordinate and make sure that we're like bringing together these coordinated projects for if it's all happening in one community and it's not kind of this over here and this over here and then all of a sudden there's a conflict because no one's talking to each other, but better coordinated approaches somehow across the jurisdictions. And on one hand, I think there's an opportunity for Metro to play a role in that, especially if we would provide kind of more, fair disclosure, I know we are in a budget crisis and everything, but if we've better resourced our community relations so that they had more time to be able to not just focus on specific projects and engagements for those, but to focus on time on building those relationships, kind of keeping track of like who are the point people in the different communities so they know where to go when the project comes up and who to talk to when issues come up. Putting in that resource and staffing that's necessary to support that type of work, it would be really important. And, I hope that one day we can do that at Metro.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, so I don't think we have time for another question to get through a full question. So, before we end with 3 minutes left, I just want to say thank you both. Oh my gosh, I feel so inspired by both of your work, and I'm excited to see what you're going to do to help transform Los Angeles into an even more amazing place, because I do have a special place for Los Angeles in my heart. So Christoph, do you want to come back on and end things?
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for the wonderful conversation. Thank you for being so candid with us today. It was very engaging. We had over 130 participants engaged throughout the conversation, which is wonderful. I think it speaks to how important this topic is to everyone and everyone with APA Los Angeles. So thank you all. Again, thank you, KeAndra and John, for joining us today. And thank you, Nina, so much for your moderation too. It was fantastic. Thanks so much. And again, we will be sending a follow-up with the links. Several people mentioned they would like to have the links to the entire talk series, which we will share. This session was recorded and it will be posted to the APA Los Angeles YouTube channel. So we'll send out links to that, and you can also watch out for it on our website. So thank you again, and have a great day, everyone. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Feel free to email me if you have additional questions. I'll put my email in the chat just for anybody.
Excellent. Thanks.
Okay.